Welcome life science learners to another installment. In our lesson today, we're going to be focusing on response of plants to the environment. What's important is that we need to understand that like us as humans, we're able to respond to the environment. Plants also have the ability to be able to respond to the environment. In our lesson today, we will be focusing on plant hormones, movement of plants towards different stimuli, which is called tropism, as well as the defense mechanisms that plants have that allow them to successfully survive in their different environments. So let's have a look at the concepts in our lessons and we'll get straight into the details. It's important that we go through a list of terms and we'll try and unpack that in our first bit of this segment, and then we're going to spend some time looking at plant hormones. Let's get straight into the important terms that we need to identify. So I'm going to introduce these for you so that you have a sense of what these are, and when we use them later on, I'll talk more specifically about them. So the concept of tropism. Tropism essentially means to turn, and occurs when an external stimuli affects the direction in which a plant grows and develops. So if we talk of tropism, it is basically a plant turning towards a stimulus. And there are various different stimuli that are present in the environment, from the availability of water, light, gravity. So these are all stimuli that plants respond to. So they're quite sensitive towards different stimuli in the environment, so we'll have to look at that as well. We're going to look at hormones, and one specific hormone we're looking at are called auxins, and these are plant growth hormones that stimulate the elongation and cell differentiation. So if we talk about the growth of a plant and its increase in height, both vertically up and into the ground, that's because of hormones called auxins. Another set of hormones that we're going to look at are called gibberellins, and it's important that we recognize this term. Gibberellins are plant hormones that actually cause the elongation of the nodes and internodes of the stems, the development of flowers, the sprouting of buds, and the germination of seeds. So this is quite a complex hormone that has a significant role in the growth of the nodes, the development of seeds, as well as the formation of fruit and flower. So we'll spend some time looking at that. Another hormone called Abscisic Acid, okay, and this is a hormone that inhibits the growth of apical buds, seeds, and roots in plants. So it's derived, if you think of the word abscess, so it plays an important role in a process of actually stopping certain things from developing. It also plays an important role in the maturation and the ripening of fruit and the release of leaves and fruit from the tree. Phototropism, and this is the growth and movement of a plant towards a stimulus of light. We also know that there is a gravity stimuli that plants respond to, and that's called Geotropism, and this is the growth and movement of a plant in response to the force of gravity. And then finally, we know that plants also respond to water, and that's called hydrotropism, and this is the movement of a plant towards the source of water. One final slide of terminology would be your chemotropism. So plants also respond to chemical stimuli in the environment, where they move towards a specific hormone or stimulus. We also see a unique adaptation of plants where they move towards objects, and that's called thigmotropism. It's also called stereotropism, and this is essentially where we see certain plants that creep and move towards a solid surface. And that ability of a touch receptor is the ability of plants to grow towards a solid object. So we see this in amongst your creepers. We also see this among plants and how they gather together and grow together. And so that's again a stimulus that is because of solid objects that they come in contact with. And then the concept of abscission, which is when we see leaves falling off a plant or we see the fruits falling and breaking off, that's because of abscission. And so, in fact, I have a fruit here with me today, and I mean, this is a mango, and it's obviously ripe now, and this would have obviously fallen off from a tree if it was not plucked by the farmer. But what's important to us, for us to recognize, is that there are points on a plant like this in terms of the fruit falling off the tree naturally, and that's because there's a hormone called abscisic acid that causes this to actually break off and fall when the fruit is ripe. So if you've ever noticed, if you've tried to pluck off a fruit from a tree, when it's green and not yet ripe, you might struggle to break that off. However, when the fruit's ripe and you have this ready fruit to be consumed, you'll find that a simple twist allows for that fruit to break off. And that's because of a hormone called abscisic acid that causes an abscess to develop for leaves and fruits to fall off. Okay, so let's get straight into understanding what is it that stimulates growth in plant. We know that plants are stimulated to grow external in terms of towards an external stimulus. So we looked at light, water, gravity, space, but there's also an internal stimulus that plants receive, and that internal stimulus we refer to as hormones. Just as humans have hormones that are carried through our arteries and veins that go to specific parts in our body, plants also have hormones that target specific areas and have a certain effect. So we will look at those hormones in a bit. So the plant hormones are essentially organic compounds produced by the plant that occur in low concentrations and act as chemical messengers. So they have a specific function to carry out. Hormones are normally synthesized in one part of the plant, and then they're transported to the other parts where they can cause a response such as the growth or the ripening of fruit or in this specific tissue. So folks, there are three main groups of plant hormones that we need to look at. The first group are the auxins, the second are the gibberellins, the third, abscisic acid. In addition to these three, there are two that we're going to extend ourselves and look at, which are called ethylene and your cytokinins. Let's have a look at the auxins. The auxins are a group of plant hormones that are mainly produced in the apical meristem. So what do we mean by the apical parts? So think of the meristematic tissue at the tips of the plant, so along your tip of your stem, as well as right at the bottom of the roots. So plants typically increase in height, growing both vertically upwards as well as into the ground. So at these ends, you'll find that there's meristematic tissue. And so your apical meristem is the elongation of the plants due to the auxins in those areas. We also have indole acetic acid. An abbreviation for that is IAA. This is the most common natural auxin occurring in plants. You'll find that the auxins tend to move downwards in the phloem from the growing tip of the stems to the cells in the lower parts of the plant. So if we were to illustrate the tip of the stem, and this was the cells that are constantly dividing, and refer to that the meristematic tissue, you'll find that the cells in these areas, you'll find that the auxins are produced, and this tends to grow in the opposite direction from the stimulus, which is light. So we have light that targets the apical parts, and we find that the auxins are produced below the apical areas, and these auxins tend to move away, causing the elongation of cells and the development of more cells in this area. And this further increases the length or the height of the plant. Small amounts of these auxins also are produced in the growing tips of the roots, as I mentioned, and so we'll find that in the root tips, we find that the root tips typically grow this way, and you'll find that at this area you've got the meristematic tissue, and the auxins are found in these areas here, which tend to move away from the stimulus of gravity, and you'll find that the elongation happens in this area here, causing the cells to grow in length vertically into the ground. However, it's important that we understand that the highest concentration of auxins are found in the growing tips of stems, and that is where maximum growth and increase of height occurs. Auxins are important in stimulating cell division, as well as the formation of roots in cuttings. You'll find that the development of flowers also occurs due to auxins. Abscission, which is the breaking off of leaves, also auxins play an important role in that, as well as it causes the tropism in plants and the roots in the stems. The last set of hormones, or rather the second set we're looking at, are called gibberellins, and these are the largest groups of hormones that are mainly produced in the terminal buds of the stems and roots, as well as in the young leaves and in the embryo in the seed. The functions of these gibberellins are to increase the elongation along the internodes of the stem. It stimulates the root growth as well as the development of flowers and new buds. It's also important in the germination of seeds. And as I said, finally, the hormone that we're looking at in this segment is abscisic acid. And abscisic acid basically is an inhibitor of growth, and this counteracts the function of auxins. And it plays an important role in helping a plant cope with stressful conditions. It is produced in the leaves, stems, and unripe fruit. And so as we wrap up this section, I'd like to show you kind of when we look at fruit and when they mature, you'll find that, as I mentioned earlier on, in this typical fruit, you've got abscisic acid being produced there. You've got abscisic acid being produced at this end, which causes the fruit to ripen as well as fall off the plant. And that's important in the seed in this fruit landing onto the ground and then germinating into a new plant. So as we wrap this section up, having looked at the different hormones and their functions, wish you guys a short break, and I'll see you back in a little while. Welcome back from the break, guys. Trust that you're well and that you've energized. In our segment now, we're going to look at plant hormones and their uses in agriculture. It's fascinating to understand how hormones have influenced the way food has been produced as well as our fruits. Having understood the functions of these hormones over the years, farmers have been able to use these hormones to stimulate the propagation of more fruit, to be able to harvest these fruit at the right time, as well as to promote better growth of fruit. So let's try and understand how have the understanding of hormones influenced the way we access fruit that are wholesome, that are fresh and ripe at the right time when we consume them. So it's important that we understand that plant hormones have played an extensive role in agriculture. They're used extensively in the production of food crop. Many of our food production has been influenced by hormones, and let's try and understand that now. So the formation of root in cuttings. Now, plants are often grown asexually by what we call cutting, and we've looked at cutting as a mechanism of asexual reproduction. Farmers often use this mechanism to propagate or to grow new plants quickly in a short span of time. The ability to be able to grow these effectively often determines or is dependent on the use of hormones. And so we call auxins used in the cutting as rooting hormones. So auxins can stimulate the development of roots, and you'll find that the roots are an important part of the success of a cutting growing. So cuttings develop bigger root systems after being dipped in an auxin containing hormone rooting powder. In this way, the plants are cloned cheaply and quickly. If we look at this image, you'll find that here's a little twig of a plant, and that's being dipped in rooting powder. And these hormone rooting powders are essentially a powder that contains auxins, and these auxins essentially allow for the quick production of meristematic tissue on the parts where the nodes have been created. So the use of hormones in the agricultural sector has influenced how quickly cuttings can grow into new plants. And if you think about that in terms of our food production, that has significantly influenced how quickly plants can be cultivated to grow into new independent plants. Folks, another use of hormones in agriculture would be in the production of seedless fruit. Now, how often have we eaten a fruit where the inconvenience of having a seed in your mouth actually puts you off that fruit? I notice that when you eat watermelons, often those large seeds and pips can really become an inconvenience. Okay, well, farmers have been able to use hormones to produce fruit that are seedless. It's amazing. I mean, that has increased the production of the fruit. It's increased the value of the fruit in terms of now people wanting to buy those. Let's understand what has been done. So what farmers do is that they spray some hormones onto the unpollinated flowers. And what happens is that due to the growth hormone present, it stimulates rapid development of the ovaries into the fruits. This means that without fertilization, the fruit now develops and grows into a seedless fruit. Guys, remember that fertilization will stimulate the formation of seeds because you've got the pollen landing. However, if you stimulate the growth of this fruit without the formation of seeds, you will end up with this fruit that has rapidly grown, essentially without having the seeds. And so this has produced seedless fruit, and we see this often in the fruit that we consume. We've eaten seedless grapes, you've probably consumed seedless oranges, or oranges where the seeds are extremely small or remnants of which, and even in watermelons. And so you'll find that these are fruit that do not have seeds, and that's essentially because the growth hormone has stimulated the development of the ovary of this plant, producing a fruit which has no seeds. The ripening of fruit also is stimulated through hormones, and so you'll find that some plant hormones such as ethylene can be sprayed onto fruits to stimulate the ripening, so that these fruits ripen at the same time and they all can be harvested simultaneously. So guys, you would have noticed that sometimes when you get to a store and if you're buying, for example, bananas, and bananas are often, if you look at them, when you buy them in the store, they appear green. And the reason why they're green is often the farmer that prepares these fruits and packages them, sends them to the store, hoping that when these are delivered in the store that they just ripe and ready to be consumed. And so soon before these fruit are placed onto the kind of the delivery trucks, they are sprayed with a gas called ethylene gas. And that ethylene gas stimulates the ripening of the fruit. And so this is a freshly harvested banana, and you'll see that over a short period of time, having calculated how long this would take to ripen, these are applied. And so this is important in essentially producing fruit that can be, again as I mentioned, that can be harvested at the right time, simultaneously, because you now want to harvest a whole lot of fruit at the same time, package that, send them through towards, and then allow for them to mature and ripen at the same time. So that's amazing in terms of the access and availability of fruit. We also know that we can increase the size of the fruit. So grapes are often sprayed with gibberellins, and this will stimulate an increase in the size of the fruit. I'm sure you would have consumed or eaten grapes that sometimes are really small, and then sometimes you get a batch of grapes that are large. And that's because, one is because of the type of fruit, but also it's because of the use of hormones such as gibberellins. And spraying this makes the internodes of the plant bigger, which provides more space for the individual grapes to actually increase in size. And this is because there's an increase in air circulation, which also reduces the infection by pathogens such as fungi. So here you're seeing a large bunch of grapes, significantly larger, and that's because of the hormone that allows for the nodes between the seeds to be larger, and that allows for greater growth of the fruit, increasing the size of the fruit. And that's amazing how these bunches of grapes actually become significantly larger. We also know that there is hormones used to stimulate germination. So gibberellins are sprayed onto dormant seeds, and these will stop or interrupt the period of dormancy, causing a uniform germination. Now what does this mean? So before seeds are planted, a farmer will apply gibberellins onto these seeds. The gibberellins, as they would do, they would activate these seeds, they will wake them up from their state of dormancy. And this allows for all those seeds to germinate at the same time. So remember that seeds germinate when conditions are favorable. So if you need to increase production and if you need to time your time of germination, gibberellins are sprayed. And so this means that these seeds that have very different rhythms of germination can now all be synchronized so that they all germinate and grow at the same time. so that the harvesting of the crop can also be timed simultaneously. So an amazing way of being able to produce fruit and time their germination or even their harvesting. The prevention of premature abscission in fruit. It's important that we understand that sometimes the time of harvesting is also important. So you want to make sure that when you harvest your crop that all the plants have produced fruit around the same time and that you maximize your time of harvesting, because that's also important in terms of production. So what has happened is that high auxin concentrations prevent the formation of the abscission layer in fruit stalks. Therefore, the spraying of the auxin delays abscission. So often fruits will tend to form and they will break off. So if you apply auxins onto an orchard, you will find that it delays the ripening of the fruit, and it means that when the auxin levels have decreased, all the fruit on that tree would ripen at the same time and be ready for harvesting. It also means that you're increasing the time of fruit development, which ensures larger fruit and timed harvesting. Harvesting dates can then be manipulated accordingly so that it can be all harvested simultaneously. What's also amazing is we know that plant hormones can be used in weed control. Farmers spend extensive amounts of money on controlling the invasion of weed. Weed obviously would be the growth of other herbs that invade agricultural lands and utilize the nutrients. So being able to control weed, which is unwanted growth, is important in increasing productivity. So having used hormones is an excellent example of how this can be used. So some synthetic herbicides, so weed killers, contain a high concentration of auxins. And amazingly, these auxins will accelerate the metabolism of these broadleaf dicotyledonous weeds. And so these plants that grow are often dicot plants that grow between our maize plants. And so being able to spray these auxins will stimulate their growth to a point that they grow extremely fast, unable to sustain their growth. And this extremely rapid growth can actually lead to them becoming weakened and die. And so this will result in the farmers successfully removing the weeds and allowing for their monocot plants, such as your plants such as your wheat, your corn, and your oats, to grow successfully. And here's an image that shows you. So here you've got your mealy plants that are growing. In between that, you can see some of your dicot leaves, and these are significantly reduced, and that's because in this lane here you can see that the farmer has applied auxins, and these have increased the growth to a point that they stop growing, and this leads to their natural degradation. So when we look at the hormones, these are extensively used in the cultivation of crop and harvesting. Welcome back, guys, from the ad break. Trust that you're feeling refreshed and that you've kind of had some opportunity to reflect on what we've just done. In this segment, we're looking at the response of plants in response to different stimuli. It's important that we understand the concept of tropism, and then we're going to move on to looking at how different factors influence plant growth. So let's look at our lesson. What is tropism? The word tropism means to turn. A tropism is a response to an external stimulus causing a plant to grow towards or away from the stimulus. A growth movement towards the stimulus is positive, while a growth movement away from the stimulus is negative. Now, having understood the concept of tropism, we need to understand that there are parts of the plant that grow towards the stimulus and parts of a plant that grow away from a stimulus. A typical example would be that when a plant grows towards the light, it is attracted towards the stimulus. However, the roots tend to grow in the opposite direction. So we say that the leaves are positively phototrophic, in this case phototropism, they are attracted towards light, and then the roots are negatively phototrophic, and meaning they move away from that. So when we understand the context of a positive stimulus, we know that it's a direction in which they're moving towards, and then a negative stimulus would be a response in the opposite direction. So let's remember that when we look at these hormones. A tropism takes place as a result of an unequal distribution of auxins in the plant. Certain plants will grow faster than others. Now, it's important that at this point we recognize, I've got an example of a bamboo shoot here, and if you look at it, it's essentially taken quite a unique shape. And this shape shows you that there's been some direction change in the growth of this stem. So initially this was growing horizontal to the ground, and then the stimulus of light changed, and you'll find that the stem began to turn. So essentially it's important that we recognize that when the plant stem was growing along this horizontal axis, that the auxins were produced in the opposite direction against the direction of the stimulus, which caused the elongation towards the stimulus. However, when the source of light changed, you found that the stem now changed direction and the auxins moved in the opposite direction, causing the elongation in the direction of the stimulus. So essentially the auxins move in the opposite direction from the stimulus, causing an elongation in the direction in which the stimulus is coming from. Okay, so I'm going to get back to this example in a bit. Let's talk about the concept of phototropism. The word phototropism essentially is derived from light. So phototropism is the growth movement of the part of a plant in response to a unilateral direction of light. So the term unilateral essentially is if you had a source of light and that light was being directed towards an object, that is a unidirectional form of light. So it's not dispersed. We're saying that it is only in one specific direction that the light is being expressed. So that is a unidirectional direction of light. Stems and leaves usually grow towards the light to absorb the maximum amount of sunlight. So that photosynthesis is therefore positively phototrophic. When the growing tip of the stem receives the light, which is from one direction, we find that the light-sensitive auxins move away from that light towards the shaded side. Let's look at this in a simple diagram. So here we're seeing, in this example, we're looking at the stimulus of light coming in one direction. At the tip of this plant we have the apical buds, and we notice that there is auxins that are produced around that area. Due to the light stimulus being from the vertical position, the auxins will tend to move away from that stimulus of light in the opposite direction. And as they move in the opposite direction, it causes an elongation of the apical area in the direction of the stimulus. And this further increases the length of the plant in terms of its height. So what is important is that the auxins diffuse down the shoot, stimulating the growth away from the source of the auxins. So as I mentioned, the auxins move down this way and causing the meristematic tissue to divide and therefore increasing the height of the plant. Let's look at what happens when the light comes from a different direction. So here we've changed the direction of the light, and we notice that if the one side of the shoot is stimulated with light, the auxins diffuse in the opposite direction. So here we're seeing that the auxins coming in from one direction. You'll find that the light comes in from one direction. We find that the auxins now accumulate in the opposite side. So that's where the auxins tend to accumulate. And this accumulation of the auxins causes an increase in the growth of cells in this region, and hence we find that now the tip tends to bend or increase in length in this direction. So we find, as I've mentioned in this example, If I hold this up, you can see that now the auxins are being produced in this opposite direction from the stimulus of light, and this causes an elongation in that area, and hence you find that this tends to bend towards the stimulus of light as the auxins accumulate here and stimulate cell division by mitosis in that area. So this is a classical example, a living example of how a plant now has moved towards a source of light and changed its direction and growth of the plant. We also need to recognize that the concept of geotropism is present and experienced by plants. Geo comes from the word gravity in response to the gravitational stimulus. So geotropism is the growth of a plant or parts of the plant in response to a unilateral gravitational stimulus. Now, we all experience gravity, which is a natural phenomenon. Plants also experiences gravity. So, essentially, if you look at this example again, you can clearly see that in a plant, the roots will positively grow down into the ground. What does that mean? It means that the stimulus of gravity is a stimulus that attracts the plant in that direction. It means that in this plant, you'll find that the seedlings also placed down will produce roots towards the soil. And you'll find that the leaves tend to grow up, or the shoots tend to grow up against gravity. So roots are positively geotrophic and negatively phototrophic. Okay, so let's hold on to that thought and let's look at this in an experiment. Okay, the auxins accumulate towards the lower side of the root due to gravity. The higher concentrations of auxins on the lower side will cause the elongation in this region. We find that the cells on the upper side of the root then begin to divide, and you'll find that growth occurs faster in the vertical direction. The roots also curve downwards, so they are positively geotrophic. Here I have an illustration where we've got that plant that is placed in a horizontal orientation. Okay. If we look at this, we see that the plant is laid on its side and the auxins gather in the lower part of the stem and root. So the plant is placed along a horizontal surface, and at the bottom of that we see the accumulation of the auxins. How does this influence the development of the meristematic tissue? Interesting. We see now that the auxins, this slows the growth in the roots, so that the roots begin to turn downward. So we see that the roots now from that position begin to turn in the opposite direction and move down into the soil. However, the auxins in the tips of the plants have moved against the direction of stimulus here, in this case light, and we'll find that the shoot tends to curve upwards, stimulating the growth of the tips of the apical buds towards light. And so we see this natural movement towards the light and the plant becoming vertical once again. We also experience stem geotropism, and this is where the auxins accumulate on the lower side of the stem due to gravity, as I showed you now, and the higher auxin concentration on the lower side stimulates the elongation in this region. The stem hence will curve upwards towards the light and against gravity. So guys, this is a simple experiment showing you what happens when a unilateral light is applied. In this experiment, we've got two plants exactly the same. The only difference is that one is present on a clinostat, and a clinostat is essentially a machine that allows for this to constantly rotate or turn. In this experiment, the clinostat is switched off, and it means that this plant is not moving. What happens is that, this is a moving clinostat and this is the stationary one, and we see that as time progresses that the plant that is stationary tends to move towards the source of light. So this natural bending means that the auxins are moving in the opposite direction, causing the elongation in that direction. However, in our control, which has the moving clinostat, we find that this plant constantly turns, the unidirectional source of light is available to all parts equally, and this in turn will stimulate just the growth of the plant vertically. We also can see that in seeds, and we can express this in seeds where we see geotropism occurring in a similar way. So here we've got in the control a revolving clinostat which is constantly turning, and here we've got in the experiment we've got a stationary clinostat. These seeds are placed in specific directions, and you would notice that the germinating seeds all tend to grow towards gravity in this direction. So the roots are bending towards gravity, whereas the apical stems or radicals tend to grow against gravity. So this is an example of how gravity influences the growth of roots and how the auxins influence the growth of the stems or the radicals and the plumule. So guys, that's essentially a wrap of how hormones influence the growth of plants, and we referred to that as tropism. We've looked at the effect of light, phototropism. We've looked at the effect of gravity, geotropism, and that's a wrap for this section. A little break, and I'll see you at the end of that. Welcome back, life science learners, to this segment. In our segment now, we're going to be spending some time looking at plants' defense mechanisms. Have you ever wondered whether a plant can respond to a stimulus? We've just looked at how plants respond to stimuli. It's important that we recognize that plants also have a mechanism of protecting themselves, and so we refer to that as plants' defense mechanisms. Like all living organisms, plants also respond to a stimulus from the external surface. So we've seen the effect of hormones influencing the growth in terms of the shoots growing towards light or even the roots growing towards gravity. However, plants have evolved over the years to be able to adapt to the environment. And this is part of natural selection in the way in which plants have adapted to their environments. There are various mechanisms that plants use in order to increase their chances of survival or to increase the chances of seeds germinating. So plants have a unique mechanism that ensures that they survive effectively in their environment. So let's look at plants' defense mechanisms. So plants, just like animals, are exposed to a variety of enemies, and these enemies could include feeding by herbivores. They could include the harsh environmental conditions such as extremely hot conditions. It could include even the effect of termites, insects, and other smaller invertebrates. So plants also have pests that live on them. However, plants have been able to adapt to that. Let's look at these adaptations. So these enemies, as I mentioned, could include insects, pathogenic microorganisms, so these are microorganisms that cause disease, as well as herbivores. We know that herbivores rely on plants. However, plants have also defended themselves against invasion from herbivores. Plants defend themselves by means of mechanical as well as chemical defense mechanisms. So we see that there are mechanical structures that have been developed, but also chemical structures. So we notice that there are different types of grass that taste different. Some are bitter, some are sour. So these are all mechanisms that plants have adapted to prevent themselves from being eaten by certain herbivores. So guys, let's look at the mechanical defense mechanisms. Again, it's important that we recognize what mechanical means. So these are physical structures that defend or help a plant defend itself. Let's get into it. There are certain structures on the surface of the plants that prevent them. Examples of these include a bark or a waxy cuticle, and that prevents the penetration from enemies. Now we often see that plants are covered with a thick waxy cuticle. That's also a mechanism to prevent the loss of water. But in addition to that, the wax on these make them unpalatable. So herbivores that chew on these often don't enjoy the taste of the waxy cuticle, and hence they obviously stay away from these plants. We also know that the hard outer bark often forms a protective layer against some of the larger herbivores that can often eat the bark or eat the stems and destroy them. So the bark is a harder outer protective that's dry, that's often tasteless, that can withstand some of the scratchings or even the gnawing at, the biting at the bark. So that's a mechanism. The fruit of the coconut is covered by multiple layers that make it, that prevent penetration and make it difficult for the seeds to be damaged. Now we often see this. I mean, you guys have eaten probably a peach at some point, an apricot. You find that the outer covering of the pip is a hard seed, and that seed often is impenetrable. I mean, if you were to try and crack that using a hammer or a stone, it doesn't break easily. So these are the mechanisms that plants have evolved or adapted to be able to survive. And it's important that these seeds are protected, because if seeds are eaten, it means that the next generation of growth cannot continue. So the coconut is a classical example of how that succulent nutritive layer is protected. There are several layers on the outside. Let's try and look at that. So when we look at a coconut, you know that it's got a dry husk on the outside, and that dry husk is a thick layer that prevents that seed from being destroyed. The embryo is present right on the inside with a whole lot of endosperm, which is that nutritive layer, which is often a source of nutrition and food. So here we see that the coconut has an outer thick layer, but in addition to that, it's got a hard shell. And that shell often, if you've kind of opened up the coconut at any time, you know that that shell becomes quite difficult to crack. And so it prevents that seed from, one, being dehydrated, but second, it prevents it from being consumed by other animals, herbivores, that would want to extract the nutrients from that lovely, juicy inner part of the coconut. Guys, we've all had some experience with thorns. And so these thorns you find on your rose bushes, you find on many trees. And one, they are a mechanism that warn off predators, or not predators, but herbivores. So you find that these herbivores that come to feed off the fruit are often will abrase their body, will rub against these plants. And on touching, you'll find that these thorns or these spikes can actually inflict some injury. So herbivores learn from this and they stay away. And this ensures that the plants actually are able to survive with minimal damage from your predators. Some plants, such as the acacia plants and even your cacti, or even your raspberry plants, have thorns and spines that discourage the herbivores from feeding on them. We'll find that the presence of the thorns slows down the feeding rate of the herbivores and may also wear down the molars over time. So here you find that these thorns actually are a protective mechanism, and they are covered by certain chemicals that actually will cause the plant to survive longer. And when these animals chew on them, it prevents them from being chewed on quickly. So it slows down the process of mastication or chewing in the mouth, and it means that they have to eat much slower. And that deters the herbivore from wanting to consume more of these plants. Okay, we also know that these acacia trees, if we look at them, have these fine spiny thorns, and these can be quite intimidating to herbivores and often injures them. So you find that it's not easy to get into the tender succulent leaves, and so these herbivores often stay away from them, and this gives that plant an added advantage of being able to survive in their environments. So this will discourage your browsers, such as your kudu, your impala, and even giraffes from feeding on the trees. And so you'll find that often when we look at your acacia trees, the giraffes tower over these and try and get towards the tender tips on the outside, which doesn't have some of the extensive thorns. And hence, when you look at these acacia trees, they're often very well manicured by the giraffes because they kind of chew on the tips that are on the edges. And that's how these acacia trees are able to survive these harsh environments which they share with their herbivores. There are also chemical defense mechanisms, and funny enough, these chemicals are often produced by the plant in a as a mechanism to defend against some of the herbivores that feed on them. So many plants produce chemicals that play a major role in preventing the herbivores. These chemicals act as repellents. Some are toxic and influence digestion problems. So you'll find that the plant material becomes difficult for the animal to digest. It's often bitter, unpalatable, and in some plants it creates certain toxic responses in the digestive system. And this could induce a process of vomiting in the animal, and this means that once the herbivore has eaten that, it knows that the next time it would stay away from consuming that. So these chemicals, they act as repellents. They basically are unpleasant to taste, and they contain certain examples of things called chemicals called tannin or quinine. Okay, these can be very toxic and often affect the nervous system and also the digestive hormones in an organism. So here's an example of the foxglove plant. It produces a toxic chemical which actually causes the breakdown of red blood cells in certain herbivores. So herbivores that would consume this would start experiencing a toxic response in their blood vessels, causing their cells to break down. So again, beautiful flowers, very enticing, but again, very toxic to certain herbivores. So guys, it's important that we recognize that at this point, as we wrap up, that plants also are able to respond to animals, and that is a defense mechanism that they have. Certain plants we mentioned have mechanical features that prevent them from being consumed. Some plants have chemical features, and these make them unpalatable to herbivores and as well to certain pathogens, including bacteria and viruses. So the chemicals that are produced are able to prevent the plants from being consumed. It is important that we recognize that plants as well have the ability to respond to their environment, both from a chemical stimulus, both from a physical stimulus, as well as respond to the threat of being consumed by other animals. Guys, you've been a fantastic audience. I trust that you've enjoyed the lesson, having a greater insight into how plants respond to the environment. I wish you well. Thank you for listening in. Have a baie lekker day. Take care.